Now we're going to walk through the book and give you all a taste for what's in it. And we're going to basically do a 3-minute thesis or elevator pitch on each of the chapters. So to get us started, I'm going to call on Scott McKinnon to talk about his chapter. So over to you, Scott.
Thank you, Margaret, and thanks again, Tom, for that those very kind words. So in 2003, fires burnt across large parts of the ACT and nearby New South Wales, and they reached into the suburbs of Canberra. 4 people lost their lives and 500 homes were destroyed. Excuse me. My chapter for the book examines the first 3 years following the fires, focusing on the intertwining of commemoration and recovery in anniversary events and in the design and construction of a memorial site. Through oral history interviews that were conducted by Dr. Mary Hutchison for the National Library of Australia, I examined the first, second and third anniversaries of the fires as snapshots in time through which we can trace the significance and the substantial challenges of commemoration as an element of recovery processes. The focus of the chapter is the ACT Bushfire Memorial that was opened in 2006 in Mount Stromlo Forest Park. After a careful consultation process, the site was designed as a peaceful space of quiet reflection, and the design aligned with the desires of many survivors. One interviewee stated, "It would be nice to sit in a bit of peace. Even if there's nobody there, you can sit and reminisce and think about things and have a quiet time." And another argued, whatever the memorial will reflect will hopefully be something that reflects that we got through it, sort of thing, rather than reminiscence about the bad, maybe the sort of more focus on the positives, that we survived it, we got through it. These views are entirely understandable from a community still recovering from traumatic events. I think they reveal, however, an inherent tension in disaster commemoration between conflicting desires to remember and to forget. Through the consultation process, decisions were made not to include commemoration of specific aspects of the fires. Any anger at the ACT government's perceived failure to provide sufficient warning of the fires was specifically excluded. So too were any efforts to educate the community about the likelihood of future fires. A memorial is an attempt both to fix memories of the disaster in a constant present, always remembered, never forgotten, and simultaneously to move on into a new future, leaving the disaster in the past. Simpson and Arwas argue that a memorial translates the unthinkable into the thinkable. Survivors sought ways of remembering the 2003 fires that didn't revive trauma, a space to sit in a bit of peace and reflect on the positives. As a consequence, it's possible that important truths became detached from the commemorative process. How then do we commemorate disasters in ways that protect survivors from trauma, while also making sure not to forget past policy failures and future disaster risk? Over time, as the population of Canberra changes and a wave of new residents move into rebuilt suburbs, the memory of the fires will fade. So in the chapter, I argue that new forms of active remembering are needed so that past policy failings are addressed and future risk is mitigated.
Thank you, Scott. So I believe it's now my turn. Well, my chapter looked at Newcastle earthquake and the Brisbane River floods. So disasters as transformative environmental forces challenge human perceptions of identity, belonging and control. And my chapter, as I said, concentrates on the aftermath of 2 specific urban disasters, the 1989 Newcastle earthquake and the 2011 Brisbane flood, to explore how these events threatened human notions of place and environmental security. In 1989, an earthquake measuring 5.6 on the Richter scale fundamentally altered Newcastle, taking 13 lives, injuring 162 people and damaging 10,000 buildings. The Newcastle Herald ran the banner headline, "Shaken but not stirred. The spirit of Newcastle lives on despite disaster." That is the title of my chapter. A familiar nod to the unflappable 007 James Bond, the headline highlights the dimensions of disaster explored in the chapter. The word shaken is an admission that the earthquake had challenged Newcastle residents' notion of place and their sense of security. Despite the region's seismological history, many were surprised that an earthquake had struck. The phrase "not stirred" was designed to assure readers that the city would recover. But the earthquake had undermined Newcastle residents' sense of identity and confronted their feelings of security. Brisbane's 2011 flood inundated or destroyed buildings, shattering the myth of flood immunity. Despite living on a subtropical river with a long history of severe floods, people in Brisbane were also shaken. Wivenhoe Dam was supposed to prevent floods, and yet over 14,000 properties were inundated by a flood measuring 4.46 metres in the inner city. The flood had exposed the city's vulnerability. In Newcastle, intense debate erupted over the preservation of damaged buildings. In Brisbane, wrath was directed at presumed dam mismanagement. I argue that in both cases, what was at stake was a desire to reassert a sense of place and human control over nature. But in doing so, both cities failed to adequately address the human-induced dimensions of natural disasters, thereby undermining potential for resilience and adaptation to environmental change. What society needs is for people to be shaken and stirred, to stimulate debate on the anthropogenic factors behind the disasters. In Newcastle, construction on alluvial soil and infill and the absence of earthquake building codes had contributed. Dense construction on the floodplain and poor development codes had intensified Brisbane's flood hazard. Wider debate on the adaptability of human behaviour after the disasters may have spurred greater action and reduced both cities' vulnerability. By clinging to the past and myths of identity, environmental security and control, these communities are destined to suffer the same fate in the future. And that's my chapter. So now it's time for Peg to tell us about hers. Thanks, Peg.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank you, both of you, Margaret and Scott, for all the work that you've done for this project. It's been tremendous. I'm a research associate at Museums Victoria, and starting in 2010, I worked with survivors of the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009, collecting oral histories and objects and other material to document Australia's most fatal fires. And they're now part of the Victorian bushfires collection at the museum. I worked mostly with survivors from Strathewen, a small settlement northeast of Melbourne that was badly hit on Black Saturday. Their oral histories complicate and disrupt dominant public narratives of resilience and rebuilding, and ask us, as outsiders, to consider not only the impact of the fires on individual lives, but also how our own behaviour both changes and is changed by what happens in the fire zone. I've written quite a lot about the narrators and their stories, so for this chapter, I looked at the story behind the stories, the challenges and rewards of working with difficult histories. One of the great strengths of oral history is its ability to contribute fine-grained, intimate narratives to events such as the Black Saturday fires. It brings a human scale to major disasters that are often difficult to comprehend, building bridges not only between the individual experience and larger social and environmental issues, but also between insiders, the survivors, and those of us outside the disaster zone. But the juxtaposition of this micro-history with an event of such enormity and destruction as Black Saturday also brings with it certain tensions for the narrators, for the community in which they live, for the collecting institution, and for the historian herself. Now, these tensions are, of course, not limited to oral histories of disaster, but they do have an added sensitivity in the face of death and destruction. So, my chapter is a discussion of the craft of oral history in times of disaster, a personal reflection on some of the ethical and methodological questions encountered while working with the Victorian Bushfires collection. In the context of my work with the survivors from Strathewen, I talk about some of the decisions made along the way. what stories to share and which to keep private, balancing competing interests in public education, community resilience, and personal recovery, and navigating that tricky terrain around conflicting accounts, unintended revelations, or counter-histories. I also examine the impact such accounts have on the collecting institution and its processes, and on the historian as a person. So I hope that this chapter will add to the conversation about the practice of oral history and help to show the importance of the individual and personal voice in trying to understand the impact of major disasters.
Thank you, Margaret. Thanks very much. All right, Gretel, it's over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Well, my chapter sprung from my PhD research, which was looking at migrant experiences of bushfire and flood in Australia. For this chapter, I chose to focus on migrants to bushfire-prone locations in regional Victoria and how they often arrived unfamiliar with their new home and its local environment. My research was based on oral history interviews with migrants that revealed how learning about the Australian natural environment was often an active process, and that the development of their environmental knowledge was an important feature of their early settlement and burgeoning sense of belonging in regional Victoria. For some migrants, learning the local environment also meant learning about the risk of bushfires, and this led some people to connect with their community's CFA, which shaped their perception of fire. Many interviewees' understandings of the Australian environment were challenged by their subsequent experience of bushfire as a force and power beyond human control. Their sensory and embodied memories of the sight, sound and speed of the 2013 Gippsland bushfires and the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires contributed to a new sense of respect for nature. And this has shaped how they later decided to live in and interact in these environments. The bushfire challenged migrants' perceptions of the environment, but it also opened their eyes to the risk and reality of future fires. Yet most migrants interviewed for this project chose to stay within bushfire-prone locations. Rather than expressing a desire to leave, many people described a changed but continuing sense of home and connection. The bushfire-prone places also provided people with a way to mourn and remember the fires. And these new environmental understandings and attachments to place were forged and shaped by the fire. I know that's a very quick overview of my chapter, but I just want to, before handing on to Rowan, when I was thinking about the book launch, I was reminded of talking to my brother last year about what it was that I was working on and writing. And I basically found myself saying that this was the book that I wish existed when I first started my PhD research. I love an edited collection. Could I find one? No. Yeah. And so my brother looked at me and went, oh, well, that's exciting. And so it really has been such a terrific experience to be part of this great group of scholars and researchers and friends, led by Scott and Margaret, of course, and to be able to think about natural disasters with this group of people and be part of making this book that I guess I wished for years ago actually come to life. So thank you for the opportunity, Scott and Margaret, for everyone who's made this come to life and everyone zooming in as well. So yeah, I'll hand over to Rowan.
All right, g'day everybody. The ideas of this chapter were conceived in disaster in January 2019 as Townsville's flood continued to rise. I sat in my flat and emailed Claire, hoping to put our expertise towards something useful. We wanted to appropriately historicise the event. Unprecedented seemed to be the only word used to describe what was happening. We roped Patrick into our plans and we hastily put together submissions for a Townsville flood panel in the green stream at that 2019 AHA conference in Toowoomba. We are grateful to Margaret, who as co-organiser of that green stream saw potential in our efforts, presumably spoke to Scott, and then together kindly invited us to be part of this wonderful collection. So this chapter is an amalgam of those Toowoomba papers. I know I'm speaking for two others, but I think we all sensed a unique purpose in this project. experiencing the floods, interrogating its pasts, and interweaving its histories into a single narrative was both an intellectual and cathartic exercise. It felt both socially and personally vital. We felt scholarly attention to flood in northern Queensland tended to focus on the region's potential to irrigate Australia's drier regions or stimulate northern development. These concerns emphasise infrastructure and rural issues and neglect the experiences of the northern cities. Established on the Ross River Plain, which is just my right here, Townsville is located within Queensland's drought-prone dry tropics. Despite the damage which accompanies them, the city has come to rely upon extreme rain events brought by cyclones and monsoons for its urban water supply. Repetitive but unpredictable cycles of below average rain followed by extreme wet weather have informed locally unique ways of processing, memorialising and rebuilding from these disasters. So our chapter explores Townsville's history of flooding and flood responses. It compares the civic responses to major flooding disasters in Townsville since 1860 and argues that the city's ambivalent position as a suburban frontier plays out in media coverage and local responses to its disasters. For the media, images of crocodiles wading through flooded streets and interviews with straight-talking locals portray Townsville as a frontier settlement. For residents of the city, water management schemes and disaster responses are expected to sustain a standard of living familiar to the suburbs of Australia's major cities. Yet monsoonal deluges and acceptance of the big wet sits awkwardly with a lack of acknowledgement of the long dry and the destruction brought by extreme weather events. The residents of Townsville and the reactions to flooding offer interesting lessons in both accepting and ignoring the local environment while constructing an urban settlement. I hope you enjoy the chapter.
I'll acknowledge that your co-authors are Claire Brennan and Patrick White, also based at JCU. So thank you very much to the three of you. So now we move on to Ian Townsend. Ian, thank you.
My chapter looks at the Bathurst Bay cyclone of 1899, and you might not have heard of it, but its main claim to fame is that it's Australia's deadliest known cyclone, killing about 300 people. Most of those people were with the Thursday Island pearling fleets. And although the cyclone struck what was then and is still a very remote area, about 2,000 people on shore and at sea experienced the worst of it. So the cyclone's really significant. It's in the record books for producing the world's highest storm tide, 13 metres. So I've been looking at the evidence for this cyclone, why, despite that really high death toll, the disaster's not well remembered, and why the official data for the cyclone, the scientific and official data for the cyclone, doesn't match the best historical evidence. And Tom mentioned earlier that a lot of the histories of disasters are written by scientists and bureaucrats, and I think that's the case in this case. No historians really have looked at this, and so the data hasn't been tested. Scientists have been reaching back into history. It's really important at the moment to do that with climate change, to get a better understanding of what happened in the past to prepare for future cyclones. This happened to be probably the worst case scenario for the Australian East Coast. It was a very big, very severe cyclone. It was extremely well recorded back in 1899. 100 vessels were at sea, and expert witnesses, ship's captains who spent their lives reading data. They had really good instruments, very accurate barometers and thermometers, recorded the cyclone, so they recorded the data. So it's interesting that this was a really well recorded cyclone, very well recorded disaster, and what we know about it doesn't reflect the evidence. So I've been looking at the evidence, seeing how it matches the scientific data, and why those differences, why we've forgotten about it. And so I think it's really important that in looking at this disaster, we reflect on other cyclones and perhaps other disasters as well, and how well they've been recorded and who's been recording them. historians tend not to. Scientists do. I've spoken to scientists who don't understand what historians do. And we have a discipline, and it should be applied, I think, to disasters. And scientists, I think, would be well advised to take notice of historians' work in this field.
Thank you, Ian. And now we go to Daniel May.
It is not arsonists who should be hanging from lampposts, but greenies, argued Miranda Devine following the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires. According to Devine, environmentalists had prevented prescribed burning for fuel reduction from being conducted, both through direct action and through the supposed infiltration of environmentalist ideology into government agencies. The aftermath of the 2009 Black Saturday bushfires saw prescribed burning inflaming passions among all sides of the political spectrum. Devine's column was simply one of the more colourful examples. In my chapter, I sought to chart the various arguments and positions that were being put forward about prescribed burning and culpability in the wake of the Black Saturday bushfires, in popular media and at the investigating Royal Commission. There was hyperbole, denial, and, frankly, appropriation into broader culture wars. Many advocates for more prescribed burning failed to address the shortcomings of the practice. Many opponents of prescribed burning failed to address the operational benefits it provides. There were references to the burning practices of the Aboriginal peoples of Victoria, though these were generally light on detail and heavy on rhetoric, and overwhelmingly positioned in the past tense. All of this appropriation, the denial, the hyperbole, I think it can be explained by two things. The first is a long legacy of culture wars and partisanship over environmental management, and the second is through a lack of what I term in this chapter fire literacy. For instance, there are different types of and strategies of prescribed burning, but in these debates, there was no consensus on how to distinguish between the different types. Similarly, there was little acknowledgement of the important distinctions in the effects of prescribed burning in different ecological communities. Not all forests are created equal. My chapter then explores the policy aftermath of Black Saturday, which was shaped by these big public debates. The policy that resulted from the investigating Royal Commission was a statewide annual target for 5% of Victorian public lands to be annually prescribed burnt. It was a failure, lasting just a few years, and was eventually replaced by a target based on risk reduction. Environmental historians sometimes say that Australia has a boom-bust ecology. I think we also have a boom-bust attention economy. For this reason, historical context on prescribed burning debates is vital. Over the summer, anyone who tuned into televised news or had a Facebook account or listened to talkback radio or read a newspaper knows that prescribed burning remains contentious as ever.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And last for the evening is Deb Anderson.
Hello, everyone, and thanks very much, Margaret. The title of my chapter is Where the Wild Things Were, which is clearly a play on Maurice Sendak's children's book. What I'd like to do is just read briefly from the introduction. I think from listening to all the other kind of elevator pitches for the chapters so far, you get a sense of, I guess, the variety of topics and approaches, historic approaches to understanding catastrophe that there are in this book. But there's a variety of, I think, approaches in terms of writing style as well. So I've approached it from thinking about the actual lived experience of disaster, in this case, Cyclone Yasi. The stories that a North Queenslander might tell you about Cyclone Yasi can swing from a world gone mad to a world plain gone. As the Category 5 storm swept in from the Coral Sea on February the 2nd of 2011, emergency services were roaming the streets with loud hailers, and I quote, in the small coastal town of Cardwell, telling people they had to evacuate, but nobody told them where to go, and nobody told the single mums with no vehicle with their kids how to get there or where would indeed be a safe place. The Bureau of Meteorology was predicting wind gusts beyond 300 kilometres an hour. With the radio, the TV, everything you turned on, it had the emergency sirens going all the time, and it's in your face, and the fear is ramped up and you can't not listen. Even the old-timer who'd seen out Cyclone Larry of 2006, Winifred of 1986, and decades of other cyclones was telling the neighbours, "This time I think we might need to run." Some did. Last-minute evacuees with no intention of leaving were suddenly throwing silly things in the car. No clothes to mention, no socks that matched, hardly any shoes or anything that was going to help. A box of frozen prawns, a bottle of champagne, 2 mahogany gliders and a kingfisher. Others couldn't run. Girringan Aboriginal Corporation, a block back from the ocean swell in Cardwell, had to stay open because people came there. 40 lives there that night, with a newborn child, mind you. Further down Victoria Street, there was one guy in a wheelchair who was hiding behind the community centre. And as the cyclone went round, he wheeled his wheelchair from one side to the other. When the wind dropped and the eerily calm eye of that 600-kilometre wide cyclone crossed near Mission Beach that night, the local police sergeant that shouldn't have been outside was lured from his home bunker by the strangest light. It was white and the clouds were rolling over the edge of it like a waterfall. And in the middle of it all were all of these birds flying round and round. And then suddenly everything just went white. Farmers inland up the Great Dividing Range would wake to find thousands and thousands and thousands of dead seabirds lying all over their paddocks. So in that intro, it's a composite of different moments in the oral histories that I've been recording in an ongoing project on the lived experience of Cyclone Yasi. And in each of these stories, people talk about the ways during the cyclone, but also in the long, slow stretch of time that trailed that so-called monster killer, Cyclone Yasi, and I quote there from the Herald Sun newspaper. These evacuees returned through what were described as almost medieval towns dotted with military tents and lanterns to this tangled mess of housing, to the devastating silence of an annihilated jungle and the irrational anger of all the local people who had stayed, who'd chosen not to leave. And they were now burdened with the memory and the sense that when they came out, the world had gone. And more than anything, these communities would just like the world to go back to what it was before. So disasters can cut deep against the grain of ordinary human experience, and oral history can present a cautionary tale from the lasting human struggle to come to terms with it. And that's certainly what I do in my chapter, and I home in on the lived experience of 2 North Queenslanders in particular. These are Kennedy residents, and Kennedy's are a little outpost that's not too far north from Townsville, where Rowan is zooming in from. And they are wildlife conservationists, and they've been involved in a breeding program to hopefully regenerate the mahogany glider. And there are only about 1,500 mahogany gliders left prior to Cyclone Yasi, and certainly much fewer since then. I guess my choice to focus on this one narrative is pragmatic, because their story is one of human and non-human environmental interconnection. And I think that with Tom Griffiths at the start so eloquently talking about this, and I quote, scary runaway experiment that we humans are conducting with Earth, it was wonderful in the interviews that I did with these 2 residents, these wildlife conservationists, Daryl Dixon and Jeff Moffat, to learn about how disaster was experienced as the loss of wild things, and that for them is this rich biodiversity that they had encountered in everyday life. And that transformed into this discourse of environmental injustice. And I guess it also allows space for the richness of detail that oral history in particular can offer in contextualising and, in a sense, actualising that cautionary tale of our imminent future. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I'll also add that the New Zealand part is represented. It's not just thrown into the title. We had Meg Parsons and Karen Fisher, both of whom are both Pakeha and Maori, and they write a really lovely chapter on the fact that for the Maori people, the disaster was colonisation. It wasn't the floods. The floods are actually regenerative, and so they actually celebrate floods. And it was they unravel the varying opinions of Maori and Pakeha in this article. So I'm sorry they aren't here today. Now, I've got the floor for a minute, so I'm just going to say that, like Scott, I am extremely proud of this book. It's been a pleasure from beginning to end to work with you all. It will hit the shelves the first week in August, so you can pre-order it if you would like to, but it's very close to being with us. It's the beauty of an online launch. We didn't have to have the book, so that took off that pressure. But thank you, everyone, for your talk tonight. I think it's given everyone a little taste of what's in the book. You can see that we've used different methodologies, different writing styles, different topics, a great geographical spread throughout Australia and New Zealand. It's a great mix of PhD students, ECR and mid-career researchers. And I'm, as I said, both Scott and I have really enjoyed working together and with you all. So thank you.